very often you would only see these male leaders that were the media darlings.
From Interfaith Alliance, this is The State of Belief. I'm Interfaith Alliance President Reverend Paul Brandeis Rauschenbusch in New York City.
As we move into the movement for Black Lives, and you've got these organizers and these leaders who are women, people from the older guard were often saying, well, you don't even have a leader, because they were looking for a male.
The much too neglected topic of the role of women in the history of the civil rights movement has come up several times just recently on this show. That's one of the reasons I am so excited that there is now a brilliant new book on the subject titled, Have You Got Good Religion? Black Women's Faith, Courage, and Moral Leadership in the Civil Rights Movement. The release date is March 26th, and this week you'll meet the author, Dr. AnneMarie Mingo.
I'm Roxy Stone.
And I'm Caitlin Beatty.
Saved by the City is a podcast from two Christian women cracking the code of faith from the mean streets of New York City.
Our podcast captures what happens when purity culture meets hookup culture, when distraction steals from devotion, and when the diversity of viewpoints and lifestyles clash against assumptions.
Gotham can be a weird place for Christian women, but we're out there, and we have stories to tell.
Saved by the City, wherever you get your podcasts. Thanks for listening.
As we keep growing our library of extraordinary interviews, I want to make sure you're subscribed to the State of Belief podcast. Please visit stateofbelief.com/new podcast. You'll hear this episode in full, as well as recent interviews with Tim Alberta, Rabbi Sharon Brous, Bishop William Barber, Najiba Saeed, and Rob Reiner and Dan Partland, talking about their documentary, God and Country. It would really help to have you subscribe, rate, and tell the people you're close to about what you're hearing. The State of Belief is made possible in great part by the generous support of our listeners. If you've made a donation, thank you for helping get these conversations heard by more people who need them. If you haven't pitched in yet, information on how to do that is available at stateofbelief.com, and you can find out more about the work of Interfaith Alliance and join us at interfaithalliance.org. And now to my guest. Dr. AnneMarie Mingo is the author of the new book, Have You Got Good Religion? Black Women's Faith, Courage, and Moral Leadership in the Civil Rights Movement. Dr. Mingo is an associate professor of ethics, culture, and moral leadership, and the director of the Metro Urban Institute at Pittsburgh Theological Seminary. An ordained itinerant elder in the African Methodist Episcopal Church, AnneMarie is the founder of Sister Scholars, an organization that supports Black women pursuing doctorate degrees. AnneMarie, welcome to the State of Belief.
Thank you so much, Paul. Thank you so much. I appreciate this opportunity to talk with you.
Oh, my goodness. First of all, let me just say I love the title of this book. It asks the right question, I think, for our time. And let me just, it seems to me, I think I read in the book that this is a reference of Micah 6:8. Can you talk about a little bit about just why it felt so important for the cover to ask that question about good religion?
Well, thanks for picking up on that. I am an ethicist, and so questions around the good do matter. But also the title comes from a spiritual. And so Have You Got Good Religion has the refrain often underneath it of Certainly, Lord. And the song was used throughout earlier periods of Black freedom struggles, but it was used in a particular way during the Civil Rights Movement, which is the era that I pay most attention to. And so thinking about the song and the question that it asks is that there must be an opportunity for religion not to be good. If the question has to be asked, have you got good religion? And so that type of a critique, even within the music as a part of doing the work, was really important to me. And so, yes, there is a Micah 6:8 reference. What does the Lord require of you? But to do justice, to love kindness, and to walk humbly with your God. That is, I believe, a part of the moral requirement of those of us who are people of faith. However, what I loved about the song, and you'll notice I use song titles throughout the book, but what I loved about this one in particular was its question of religion. Because what I understood that to mean is that many of the people who were active in the movement, who utilized this song as a part of what motivated them, is that they could see religion operating in a way differently from what they saw it as that may or not have been good. And so this is one of the ways that we get to lift that up.
Same as it ever was. I mean, I think it's just really important, especially for those of us, myself and yourself included, who are in the religion world, to really acknowledge religion can do some terrible things to people.
Yeah.
And I try to mention that everywhere I go. I have no special privilege because of religion. It's a question of what is your religion going to do? And we know that many of the worst things that have happened in human history have been legitimized by religion.
Yes.
As well as some of the best things. And what I love about this book, and I really just I'm going to underline it one more time for our listeners. Have You Got Good Religion? Black Women's Faith, Courage, and Moral Leadership in the Civil Rights Movement. What you did was introduce us not only to the ideas of what was going on in that period, but to the people. And that felt just wonderful. It was like, I felt like I was meeting all these new heroines who I could now, really go deep with. But let's start actually with your mother and your aunt, who, by the way, were brave in a couple ways. And I'm going to let you tell the story, but they were not only brave in they were going out and, standing up to an oppressive, systematic, a way of diminishing who they were in their personhood, but also within their family. Tell that story, because I think it's a great way to start.
Absolutely. So a big part of why I do this work is because of my mother and my aunt Eunice, who were young people growing up in Tallahassee, Florida, state capital of Florida. And they had witnessed their father participate in the bus boycott, which happened in Tallahassee, which we often don't talk about. But they had witnessed that. And then they also saw students at Florida A&M University, which is also my alma mater, participating in some of the sit-ins. And they were determined that they were going to do something to make a difference. They knew that they probably couldn't do a lot of big things, but they wanted to still participate because they needed things to be better. They'd experienced all of the types of injustices and things to minimize who they were in their personhood. And so they decided that they were going to go and sit in at one of the 5 and 10 stores in downtown Tallahassee. However, my grandmother was very strict and did not want them participating at all. And so they had multiple fears going on as they are making their way to the lunch counter to sit down. They were surely afraid of white retaliation. I mean, that was what most people would have been afraid of. But they were more afraid that a neighbor would see them sitting there and go back and tell my grandmother, Annie Lee, and that they would really catch it when they got home. But they did it anyway. Yeah. And that was always the thing that got me, because I knew my grandmother, right? She didn't play. And so they went anyway, because they knew that this was about something bigger than whatever type of reprisal they might have gotten from the white folks or at home if my grandmother found out.
Right. There was an internal moral compass that just made them do something, and I think we all are benefiting from it. The entire society benefited from these small. We can call them small. They weren't small. They were huge. But these episodic small things that were happening that ended up being big things and really necessary things and important things. You talk about something that I thought was really important. I want to bring up at the top of the interview, the everydayness in some ways of the work. And I don't know if that's an example, because that was very kind of a special moment, but there's a way that we're going to get into some of these big, important women that we need to know about. But there's also the everydayness of people doing the thing in their lives that isn't flashy, but it is rooted in this moral commitment, this ethical commitment that you know so much about, to the world, to their neighbors, and to elevation, of their community.
Yeah, I use the language of everyday very intentionally, because what I find very often when I'm talking or teaching about the civil rights movement is that people will lift the names of the really well-known people, and that's all that they see. that's all that they understand movement through. Those who the media has been able to lift up, or those who, someone has decided this will be our person and we'll write enough books about this one person. But if you look at any picture during the civil rights movement, you see all of these folks. And that was what was important to me. I was like, but who are they? Sure, we know the Kings, right? Sure, we know the Rosa Parks. Sure, we even know the Fannie Lou Hamers. We know the Wyatt T. Walkers. We know the John Lewises. But who are all of those other people? What got them out there, and then what kept them out there? And so one of the when I moved into the language of everyday, a part of that was also because I was thinking through the Montgomery bus boycott, which is one of those earlier, larger movements that we do know quite a bit about, right? I actually start most of my movement conversations around the decision of Mamie Till Bradley to make the world know what happened to her son, because that's what influences Rosa Parks when she's seated. She says, I thought about him and I stayed seated, right?
This is Emmett Till's mother.
The murder of Emmett Till, yes.
Yeah, it's important. I just didn't want to go quickly over that because that was such an egregious moment in American history. And it's important to connect that
Yes.
to the movement.
Absolutely.
That these things are related.
So when Emmett Till is murdered August 28th, 1955, that influences so many of the people that I later work with, but also one of the most well-known persons that we normally lift up. What the choice of Mamie Till Bradley to make the world know what had been done to her son allows someone like a Rosa Parks to be aware of it, and she uses that as her motivation to stay seated on December 1st, 1955, right? But within that Montgomery bus boycott, December 5th, 1955, and making its way for 381 days, that is an everyday commitment to keep walking, to keep protesting, to stay off, to disengage, to figure out something else. Those were not big, well-known people. These were everyday folks that you would walk by when you were going to the grocery store, that you might see on in a store someplace else or in some. These were the everyday women. And a big part of this for me, Paul, is that I don't want people to get confused and believe that they can't do anything today because media hasn't approached them, right? Or because they don't have a quote unquote large platform. It's in the everydayness of making choices to live a better life and to create a better world for the rest of us that change can actually happen.
And what I like about, of the many things I like about this book is the everydayness is suffused throughout the book. So you're introduced to people, and yeah, you do profile some big people, some of whom, by the way, big people who I had never heard of. I'm embarrassed to say, but I think it's important to be honest. And there's a reason I haven't heard about them, because they haven't been elevated in the same way that some had. And so you do that, but then always within that, there's a surround story of all these other people. And I think it's important for us just to stop and talk about the genderness of this. And it has been very interesting to, in several conversations this year, the gendered nature of specifically the March on Washington has come up several times, and it's important that people are beginning to recognize that we have and then it would be easy to fall into like, oh well, no, there were women helping. And it's like, no, that's not what we're saying. There were women organizing it, creating the mental idea of it. They created it, and yet they weren't on the platform. And I think that I talk about that a little bit from a personal standpoint, even growing up yourself, looking around and saying, okay, what happened there? I mean, that's part of it has to be part of the impetus to write a book like this.
Yeah, well, yes, absolutely. And unfortunately, we still see that today, where many of the women who are the strategists, the architects, those who are making it happen are ignored. But one of the things that I've always appreciated that the women did not get caught, the women that I studied didn't get caught up in, was the fact that they were ignored. They still did the work anyway. But we do know within the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom and many of the other more nationally known struggles that were happening during the civil rights movement and even today during the movement for Black lives, many of the main strategists, the originators of the thoughts and ideas, those who put the things in place to make it happen, were the women who didn't get caught up on, well, they didn't talk to me yet. They didn't invite me to this yet. They just said, we need the world to be better. So we're going to do this. We're going to do this.
Yeah.
When we think about even the March on Washington, very often we think about sort of the bigger names, the bigger organizations. So the NAACP, the Urban League, CORE, those others. The NCNW should have been a part of that from day one. They were always considered a part of the Big Six.
Say what that acronym means.
So the National Council of Negro Women, which at the
Oh,
time
yeah.
was led by Dorothy Height, she should have been there. She was a
Yeah.
part of that network of large, impactful Black organizations that were doing the work of justice.
Which, by the way, had been around for decades. That was
Yes.
not a new organization. And they
Not a
had
new
been
organization.
standing up since, the beginning of the 20th century. That's an old organization that had done the work.
Absolutely.
And had been present in many of the other justice fights, whether or not they had been treated as equal partners, but they had been there.
They had been there and they were there during that civil rights movement era and specifically with the March on Washington.
Yeah,
So you've got
yeah.
all of these women who are coming and they've got their NCNW signs and they've been organizing to get busloads of people there. They are the masses, right? They are a part
yeah.
of organizing and engaging and empowering and activating the masses. And
Yeah.
yet they're told, no, you can't speak. Right?
Yeah,
We see the same thing end up happening with a number of other women who were supposed to speak, and then the mic sort of gets taken, right? There are all of these stories
Oh, dear.
about what happens during the actual March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom on August 28th, another August 28th event, and yet the women just kept doing the work anyway. They created alternative spaces to keep activating folks. Because you
Yeah.
don't get this movement without everyday women. You don't get this movement also without local leaders who were very often women operating outside of the formal structures, but they had the networks to actually make it happen.
Well, one of the things that's so interesting to me, and that you are a theologian and an ethicist, and you talk about God and you talk about moral, like how we act with one another, and these are things together. Which brings me to the church, and specifically the role of the broad umbrella of what we call the Black church in this movement. And I would love for you to talk a little bit about how you from this book and this research, how did the Black church operate in we because King is such an exemplar and well deserved, by the way. None of this is to take away anything from Dr. King. He was in the church and he was out there in the world. And I think that there were many people like that, but many of the pulpits men were in the pulpits, but many of the women in those churches were very powerful. Can you talk about the role of women in the Black church in the civil rights movement?
Yeah, very often, and I'm glad that you point that out about King. I don't know why very often there is this disconnect from the reverend portion of Dr.
I've written about that before. Like, don't pretend like that wasn't central to why he was doing everything. Dr. Martin Luther King. I'm like, well, yes, that's part of it.
Yeah, but reverend before doctor.
And also his father, a very
his
important
grandfather.
pastor, and his grandfather. All of these. This is not like something he just came up with. So very important, and it was the fuel.
Yeah.
As you're talking about, like, same with these women, it's the fuel that allowed him to keep going. It wasn't his doctorate necessarily.
Right. And so very often when we start to think about the civil rights movement, people think of it as a social movement, but it was really a spiritual movement. And so the church is critical to this space. It was one of the few places that people had generally free access to be able to do some of the work. And I say generally free because there were a number of churches that did not participate, a number of Black churches, let me be specific, that did not participate actively during the civil rights movement time period. We make these assumptions. Oh, back then, everybody was together. Everybody was participating. But I've never seen a number that goes very high with the percentage of participation.
Yeah, I had a chance to interview the Representative John Lewis, who, of course, knows of what he speaks. And he said, if every church that now says they were involved in the civil rights movement had actually been involved in the civil rights movement, we might have gotten further faster.
Absolutely.
There's a lot of backward. Just to underscore your point, it's true.
Absolutely, and certainly he knew. And so one of the things that has always been interesting to me is our need as the Black church to be this space of liberation, even if not everybody was participating, right? So that's a part of why you have people today saying, "Oh yes, and back then we were XYZ." But there were a few churches who were bold enough to participate, and we're thankful for those. There were, and I was just sharing about this recently, that very often there were other Black churches who didn't participate for good reasons. Their mortgages could have been called immediately
Yeah.
for participating if
Yeah.
they didn't fully own the church right out, right? Insurance could have been canceled immediately, right? The church bombings that were happening could have been immediate. So the fears of
So
Black churches
important.
even opening up their doors for a mass meeting, well, it made some sense. But I'm so thankful for the ones who did, especially the ones that were large enough to allow people from other churches to make their way into those doors and get the support that they needed. Very often, mass meetings were on Mondays, right? Giving you what you need to make it throughout the rest of the week. So there was tons of singing that would take place during these mass meetings within those Black church spaces, tons of praying that would take place within those spaces before the speaker or the preacher got up. That's what gave the people what they needed to keep making it forward. And so within the singing, you have people who are changing the lyrics of songs immediately in that moment. It was organic. They weren't passing out sheet music and saying, okay, well, right now, this is how we're going to sing about, have faith if you go to jail. They just made the song up in the moment. And that is how we get a chance to see their theology. How is it that they understand God operating in this moment that can give each other next to them the support that they need, the encouragement that they need to go another day of standing up for justice? So the Black church plays a great role, but it's not that everybody was participating. The Black church also, though, became this space for organizing, so that you could meet in the basement of a church, right? You could have strategy sessions there at a church. You could have pastors who were connected to some of the other organizations. So I give the example within the book of Mount Teman AME in Elizabeth, New Jersey. And that pastor, Reverend Watts, who is doing this work along with the NAACP there and encouraging his congregants to get active, saying, yeah, God can do some things, but we've got to do it too. Those types of sermons and interactions are important lessons that we can still take today, in that they were not necessarily afraid that if I speak up and say this, my tax exempt status is going to be challenged and I can't do it. We didn't have that same type of interaction happening then.
Yeah. I think that that it's an interesting that what I think is so helpful about your book is that you don't kind of end it in the past. You bring it forward. And I think, and it invites some of the same questions we were just talking about. What is the role of the Black church today? But where are also other locations of spiritual power that is being exercised outside of the kind of traditional, or what we think of as formal, like Black church or frankly, mosques and other places? Up next, more with AnneMarie Mingo. You can hear full episodes of The State of Belief anytime on our website at stateofbelief.com. You'll also find links to topics we discussed this week, as well as transcripts and more. And make sure you subscribe to this podcast at stateofbelief.com/new podcast. You're listening to The State of Belief, where religion and democracy meet.
Hey there, curious minds.
Get ready to embark on a unique journey at the crossroads of money and religion with our new podcast, Money Meet Meaning.
The seductive effect of money, we think it can do the work that God does because there's something about money that does that. It's wild.
I'm Amber Hacker.
And I'm Tom Levinson.
Tune in for a blend of wisdom and levity as we decode the path to a more meaningful relationship with money.
I think giving, and this is a little crass, but I feel like it's the ultimate middle finger to money. It's liberating to give some away.
This podcast is your gateway to a vibrant and thought-provoking exploration of the interconnectedness of wealth and spirituality.
Join us as we unravel the surprising influence of ancient wisdom on modern finances.
Faith pervades people's lives and our society. And because money is such an important part of people's lives, exploring that intersection of faith and money, I think, is super, super interesting.
Get ready to be informed, entertained, and inspired to transform your financial outlook with Money Meet Meaning. Available wherever you get your podcasts.
Welcome back to The State of Belief. I'm Interfaith Alliance President, Reverend Paul Brandeis Rauschenbusch. My guest is Dr. AnneMarie Mingo, author of the new book, Have You Got Good Religion? Black Women's Faith, Courage, and Moral Leadership in the Civil Rights Movement. You do lift up, which I thought was really important, Bree Newsom as one of your exemplars, and also, some of the Black Lives Matter folks who, frankly, there was a little tension. I don't want to overstate it because many black churches were supportive of Black Lives Matter, but there were some who were a little unnerved by the womenness or the queerness of the Black Lives movement, and so I think that's really interesting as we talk about moral courage of the civil rights movement and playing that forward, and some of the through lines that come, like how moral courage may have some different ways it's expressed, but there's a through line of moral courage.
Yeah. As we talked about the sort of historic portion of the movement, very often you would only see these male leaders that were the media darlings. As we move into the movement for Black Lives, and you've got these organizers and these leaders who are women, people from the older guard were often saying, well, you don't even have a leader. Because they were looking for a male. They were looking for a Black man that was probably Baptist that could get up and say some things on behalf of the people, right? So clearly you can't have a leader because I don't see the Black male, right? Or I don't see the Malcolm, I don't see the Martin, I don't see the names. And that there was a point where they literally were naming, who is your Malcolm? Who is your Martin? And they kept saying, well, this movement for Black Lives is leaderless. But most of the people that I've been doing work in community with who are activists, they've studied the civil rights movement. They know what happens when you put up one leader. They understand how ego operates within, but they also understand how people can then easily take off that top leader. And so they understood themselves as not leaderless, but leaderful. And so they've got leaders at every level, many of them women, many of them queer, many of them pushed to the margins of society in ways that they can actually see and critique society differently than those who are closer to the center would be able to do. And so I was excited that as I thought about the book, I said, well, then I've got to talk to religious leaders today who are actively involved in the movement for Black Lives. And the gift of this 21st century is that I get a chance to interview Black women pastoral leaders that I would not have been able to do back during the 50s and 60s. Not to say that there were not women, there were a few. And generally outside of the traditional Baptist and Methodist Black churches, we had some spiritual leaders. But this time I get a chance to interview the Leslie Callahans of the world, the Tracy Blackmans of the world, right? The Pamela Lightsons of the world.
So, I went to seminary with Leslie Callahan. She was my colleague. And we already knew she was going to be amazing because she came in amazing, and now she is just spectacular. And of course, all of these women, Tracy West and Tracy Blackman, all of these people are just spectacular. Another group that I just want to lift up is my dear friend Lisa Anderson, who I also went to. I don't know if you know about the Sojourner Truth Leadership Circle, but they are doing some amazing work around Black women's leadership that is just like, and you talk about like I want to get into this. I want to get into the spirituality of that movement as well, because you really, I just love the trajectory. You bring it all forward and different manifestations, but the importance of rest as well as joy in this, kind of new idea of what it means to be a part of a movement, but not as, and this is something that that Lisa Anderson has said in the Sojourner Truth Leadership Circle. She says we're not going to have a revolution built over the lives, the dead lives of Black women.
Yeah.
And so she's, I talked a little bit about like the role of rest, the role of joy, the role of like really recognizing that people, that's part of the movement.
That is a part of the movement.
It's not just so you can get up and do it again. It's
Yeah.
part of what it means to be a movement.
Well, to do it again, even if you do get up and do it again, it's to do it again well. And that's, again, one of the beauties of being able to study this contemporary movement is that they have looked back to understand, well, what could have been better during that time? I'll also note that there is a circle of council of elders who were some of the movement leaders in the 50s and 60s who meet regularly, and they are in conversation with some of the leaders today to give them some insights into make sure that you are circling your people, that you don't allow somebody to get worn out to the point that they can't come back, that you pull them out early enough, allow them to rest so that they can re-enter refreshed and well. So wellness in this contemporary moment is because they've been studying the past. They don't want to allow themselves to go down that far. And so we have the introduction of things like the NAP ministry, that a lot of people are saying, okay, this is a part of our activism, that we actually disengage from this capitalist system that would have us working until we're broken. But we say, no, this is a part of how I do this work. I do care for my body. I'm not simply this thing that is a robot that can do this without caring for oneself. And so that becomes critical, the rest, but also the joy, to dance, to laugh, to find, humor in something, to not take it so seriously, even though it is serious, right? To recognize that that type of a release can be cathartic and that it's important and that you are no less an activist because you smiled than if you did not, right? That we can actually see the humanity in ourselves and others. We can get up and let our bodies move. We can stay connected with who we are as we do this work to make things better for others. That is a gift that this current movement is helping us to realize, that it doesn't take our physical life to be able to do the work. We can stay well and stay whole if we don't take it all on, if we step out when we need to, and trust that we've equipped and empowered enough other people to keep it going until we're well and rested enough to come back in. That again is the beauty of studying others. Because if you think that what the media has shown you, that there was this one person or maybe these two people, then if you come into the movement, you think it's all got to be on me. But if you've been in conversation with others who were there in the past, you realize it shouldn't all be on me. Let me build a network so that when I have to step aside to care for myself, the whole thing doesn't crumble. We've got others who are also equipped. That's the beauty of a leader-full aspect of a movement. Many of them have studied Ella Baker. They believe in participatory democracy. They understand that it needs to spread out wide and deep, but the width matters, that there's more than one, so that you can actually care for yourself.
In fact, you have a great line there, civil rights movement as long, wide, and deep. That was a new one to me, but everything you just said, not everything has to be accomplished immediately. Yep. There's a depth to this struggle, and also there's a collaborative and nature to it, and making friends along the way. I'm glad you mentioned Ella Baker, who I have heard a little bit about, and not as much as I should be immersed in it. And your book helped me kind of remember some things I've been told and new things. But there were names that I had not known, and I'm gonna lift them up now and invite you to just introduce them a little bit to us, so that we can go away a little bit more full of wisdom. There was a Reverend Dr. Prathia L. Hall.
Yes.
Who was she?
Prathia Lynn Hall was an amazing preacher, an amazing organizer, an amazing strategist. She was also a professor and an ethicist down the road, and a pastor. Raised in Philadelphia, she had been a part of activism and friend circles, etc., as a young person, and wanted to be active in the civil rights movement in the South. Her father said no. After her father's passing, she's able to go. And so she becomes one of the leaders in Southwest Georgia. But Prathia Hall, she's coming more into our knowledge today because there are new books around her, and there's more of an understanding of her role in a portion that we were talking about earlier, the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom. That refrain of "I have a dream" is something that King picks up from a Prathia Hall as she's praying in Southwest Georgia with that refrain. And he says, as she's riding with him back to the airport, "I'm gonna use that." And he does. He ends up using the refrain that she uses. But Prathia Hall is also the person that Martin Luther King Jr. says, that's the one person I don't want to have to come up behind in the pulpit. She was that powerful of a speaker and a preacher. She was that, engaging, and that just the way that she was able to think and inspire people. He was like, she's the one I don't want to have to come up and follow.
That is an amazing story. Oh, wow. That all of what you just said, I mean, it's really spectacular. The other one I really want to just hear a little bit more about is Dr. Willa Beatrice Player.
Yeah.
She was also someone who was just had not come across all of this. I'm embarrassed to say, but you know what? It just, there have been some people who have taken a lot of our emotion, and it's easier just to move on. And instead of what you gave us with this really great book is a chance to go deeper and learn some new friends, some new inspiration, some new recognition of just the gift of these women to our country and to the movement for the equality and justice for Black folks. So.
I'm so glad that you're picking up on that. So the names that you are lifting right now are the women that I bring in as moral exemplars that give these examples around the core virtues that I'm lifting up of freedom faith. So Prathia Hall is the one that I use as the example for freedom faith, courageous resistance. And so Willa B. Player was the president of Bennett College, which is in Greensboro, North Carolina, literally across the street from North Carolina A&T. And so she's president at the sort of height of the movement, especially as the sit-ins are beginning to happen. Very often we will go in our mind to February 1st, 1960, and we think about these 4 male students from North Carolina A&T. And we see them, sort of walking away from their first sit-in. And then although it's not the first of sit-ins that are happening, it's the one that gets the media attention. What we often don't know, though, and what I try to lift here in the book, is that the idea for these sit-ins had been come up with. It had been inspired by these students from Bennett. Bennett is an all-female school, so all of these Black women had come up with this idea for a sit-in. They had been working with and meeting with some students from North Carolina A&T, which was men. But their president, Willa B. Player, said, why don't you hold off and wait until the beginning of the spring semester? Because they were going to do it around the holidays. And she didn't want there to be this disruption of their momentum. However, the men went, February 1st before everybody else could get it together. So by that second day, you've got all of these Bennett women. And so I just want to name that because they jumped the gun and they knew that they were jumping the gun, right? But even prior to that, Willa B. Player had making some moves and making some choices there in Greensboro that others were afraid of. So I'm going to hop back to something we were talking about earlier as it relates to the Black church. Martin Luther King Jr. wanted to come to Greensboro, North Carolina, and was looking for a place to speak. Not a single Black church would open up their doors to allow Martin Luther King Jr. to speak there. Willa B. Player said, you can come and speak at our chapel at Bennett College. Wow. And so when King speaks in Greensboro, it's on the campus of Bennett College. Some of the young men who participate in that very first day of the boycott or the sit-in on February 1st were there in the audience, listening and being inspired and equipped by that action that Willa B. Player makes as the president of Bennett College. She says, y'all are afraid to open the doors? That's okay. We'll just open up the doors of our chapel here. And I'm going to make sure that my students also get a chance to hear. So she has speaker systems and other types of ways of communicating so that everybody could get a chance to hear King on that day. So that's just a couple of the things that she does. Yeah. But then as her students begin to get arrested during these sit-ins, she says, well, this is a part of their education. We're teaching them liberal education. We're teaching them to be politically aware, civically engaged. So they won't get, They won't get punished for that. If anything, I'm going to have the teachers go to the jail and make sure that they can continue to learn. So she gave her teachers permission to go to the jails to be able to continue to teach the students, to make sure that they got their homework, to make sure that everything was continuing. And she says, no, don't get, that's a part of your learning too. That type of activism is a part of your learning too. So those types of stances, when the president of North Carolina A&T was saying nope, he was sort of, leaning in to the political pressure and not allowing his students to do the same thing. She makes this bold step and says, oh, absolutely not. The Bennett Bells, as the women of Bennett are called, will be participating, and they'll have my full support as president.
That is a great story. Great story. And, I was just, flashing on, I've been to, I won't say all of them, but I've been to many of this kind of civil rights museums that we have. And I'm curious, I hope they invite you.
I hope so
to
too.
Speak. No, I mean, really, they, because there are exhibits, if you go to Memphis, exhibits, and it's very clear who's featured there. And this story, it should have its own floor. These are really important stories, and the important of, again, brave women's spaces.
Yeah. So in this instance, there's so many things that I don't even really list about Willoughby Player. And I believe that someone is doing a book on her now. I'm starting to hear some rumblings around that. And I hope so. There is a book, but there's supposed to be some new stuff. When I was interviewing a couple of the women that I feature in the book, and then others that don't fully get featured, but I also interviewed, were Bennett Bells. So they were students at Bennett College during the time. And one described to me how they actually created a system to do babysitting for other women who wanted to vote, but couldn't really fully take off and leave. So they would go to people's homes, babysit the children so that the mothers could go and vote. That was a part of how they thought of themselves as participants in this civic invention, right? This idea of democracy that is so fragile within our nation. This woman helped create the type of space as the president for her students to say, even if we can't necessarily vote right now, we can make sure that the people who can have the freedom to do so. And all of those things really matter. That's also the everydayness that you were noting before. Right?
Right. Babysitting so that other people can participate. That's the everyday. That's it doesn't all have to, it doesn't all have to be Instagrammed. I mean, it can, these are these really important moments. And I just really, I think this is so interesting. And what I want to kind of get into is the recognition again, and we started out like this, and I want to bring it back up as we begin to close. Is there were religious forces, just to name it, specifically white religious folks, including the KKK, including the people that King writes about, Go Slow. There were religious folks who were really, they had a different vision of what America was meant to be, and it didn't include anybody but themselves.
Yeah.
And it's just important, because we're living in a moment where that sensibility that we might call today white Christian nationalism, or, that is very much still present, and it claims a mantle of religion to exclude, in fact, many of the people who are manifesting this spirit of liberation today, especially the blackness, especially the queerness, especially the immigration, especially the non-Christian, Jewish, Muslim, and other.
Yeah.
And they're, they have this idea of who really belongs and who really counts in America.
Yeah.
And so when we're not, this is not a nostalgic book particularly. This is a book that's meant for meaning in this day.
Yeah.
Because, if we think about the civil rights movement as back then, and isn't it great we did that, which I know none of my listeners do, and I don't need to say it to you. But there is a sense like, okay, well, that's been, resolved. And I think for many who are white Christian nationalists, who are like, whether or not they call themselves or not, but by the fact of their actions, they are indicating that they say, well, actually, we went a little too far with all that. Teaching books like yours is problematic.
Yeah.
Because it creates some sort of, I don't know what they say, but I'm not going to pretend. But you know what I'm saying? Like, they're trying to shut down history.
Yeah.
They're trying to shut down, awareness and shut down anything. And so what do you say, what do you think what would you like for your book to show up in this present moment as we have this resurgent moment, which is becoming more and more explicitly anti-Black, other religious minorities, anti-queer? What would you like the message of your book to come through today?
Thank you for the question and for that context, because it is so important. A part of it comes back to what you asked me at the very beginning around the title. This is a reflexive title. It requires you to ask questions of what you say you believe. And for me, if what you say you believe cannot be lined up against love as being reflexive of it, right? Of justice, of hope, of peace, of all of these things that we as Christians would say are foundational to who we are, then you need to make some changes in what you're seeing. And so the exclusivity, the nationalism, you had a great interview recently with Anthea Butler, right? And her work around white Christian nationalism is amazing. All of that stuff, the fact that they aren't being critical is what's so concerning to me. And all of the actions around limiting access to books, limiting access to other forms of education is a part of becoming less and less critical, right? Because we're becoming less and less aware. It's very troubling to me that someone would celebrate, I would prefer to not be woke. Let me be asleep. Let me remain disengaged. To celebrate that is just dumb. Paul, can I call it the way I see it?
You can call it dumb. Well, here's I've said this before, and I'll say it again, because I had the chance of just being near Toni Morrison when I was working at Princeton. And my thought is, if you are too afraid to read Toni Morrison, you probably shouldn't be thinking about college. Because then it means that you're not able to really do what college was meant to do, which is expand your mind, expand your perspective, introduce you to new experiences, and be challenging, and also provide like she's literally the best writer we've ever produced. That's a big statement, but it is at least one of them. And so I think that to call it dumb is almost a compliment. It's like it's willfully ignorant.
Willfully ignorant, absolutely. And I'm concerned for us as a nation because we are allowing people to we're allowing the voices of those people to take up more space than they need. Because I don't really believe that they are the majority, and yet they are given the space to continue to do that. And our lack right now of engagement around the political process that could help us to counter some of this stuff is something that should be taking place in the churches, and it's not. I mentioned it briefly a little bit earlier as far as Black churches during the civil rights movement, not necessarily being afraid that, they're going to pull my tax status, right? I have a concern that many of the churches today are not speaking up on these things because they use as a crutch, well, I can't have that. I've got to keep a separation between church and state. And yet these other church spaces, these white evangelical Christian nationalist churches are doing it without batting an eye. And so we've got to find our own voice and our courage and our faith to actually challenge the stuff that we're seeing. And so that for me is certainly a part of it. But it's not all, but it's certainly a part of it. One of the things that I use this as one of the stories in the book. It's something that Marjorie Wallace Smith told me about her experiences in Birmingham as a child when she's walking by a white church and the kids begin calling them names, right? Names that we would consider quite troubling, begins spitting at them, etc. And she's walking on her way to church, to Sunday school, while these people, these white young children, are playing outside of their church. And so then she comes back home and asks her dad, well, they must have a different God than our God. Like, how is it that these young people could do those types of things if they actually believe in a God of love and justice and peace and understanding and inclusivity, et cetera, et cetera? The challenge right now is that those young people are the age of the ones doing this kind of work that we're seeing right now. They had been shaped in that type of white Christianity for a long time. So this isn't new, Paul, right? We are seeing it more boldly without the shields and the coverings. But this stuff it's been baking for a long time. It's been baking for a long time.
Yeah. Dr. William Barber, who I also had on this show, was talking about how what they're worried about is not about other kids being woke. It's about their own kids getting woke.
They don't want to know that they were the ones doing that spitting and that torment. They don't want to know that. They don't want us to know that. They'll pull all of the books. They might see my picture in one of those things.
I mean,
right?
really. Listen, we end all of our shows here trying to give a little hope. And so I would love for you, AnneMarie, Mingo, to talk about what gives you hope right now.
That's a great question. I have as one of my personal mantras to always leave room for hope. Because hope can become a powerful tool, especially in the face of so many things that feel hopeless. And I would say one of the things that brings me hope right now are the younger people who are not falling victim to what the society would seem to want them to do. Instead of saying, oh, they don't want me to read those books, they're saying, they don't want me to read those books. Let me go read them. Right? Let me begin to use language that I didn't necessarily know that I needed, but these books allow me to have. Now that I've got that additional language, I can see these systems and structures in ways that I can say, I might not be able to challenge the whole thing, but in this part, I can have that conversation with my uncle because he says that stuff every time. And I now know that this is this thing and I can challenge it. Right? So I am inspired and I have hope from young people who are saying, I won't accept what you're trying to tell me to do, but I'm going to actually lean in to what you're telling me not to do. So because I know that there's some power there. I often ask my students, pay attention to how power is operating. And then that's how you can figure out what you need to begin to challenge. And my hope is found in the fact that people are challenging it. And we can't get caught up in the louder voices that would have us think that nothing is being done. These folks are doing it. Young, old, black, white, polka dot. They're doing the work. And it's time for us to try to elevate those everyday folks who are taking the risk in small and large ways to make the world better for those who are still to come.
Well, amen to that. I can say it, and I will say it. Dr. AnneMarie Mingo is Associate Professor of Ethics, Culture, and Moral Leadership and the Director of the Metro Urban Institute at Pittsburgh Theological Seminary. Ordained in the African Methodist Episcopal Church, she is the founder of Sister Scholars, an organization that supports Black women pursuing doctorate degrees. AnneMarie Mingo's new book is titled, and write this down right now, people, Have You Got Good Religion? Black Women's Faith, Courage, and Moral Leadership in the Civil Rights Movement. The publication date is March 26th. AnneMarie, thank you so much for being part of the State of Belief.
Thank you so much for this opportunity, Paul. I've really enjoyed the discussion.
Please be sure to subscribe to The State of Belief at Apple Podcasts or your favorite podcast platform, or at stateofbelief.com/new podcast. We need your help to keep making The State of Belief. Become a partner in this crucial work with a financial contribution today. Information on how to donate is available at stateofbelief.com. That's stateofbelief.com. And share what you're getting out of this show with the people in your networks. Let's get more people listening and keep these conversations going on Facebook and Instagram with the handle @StateOfBelief. The views and opinions expressed on this program do not necessarily reflect those of Religion News Service or Religion News Foundation. The State of Belief is produced by Ray Kirstein and is a production of Interfaith Alliance. Become a member today at interfaithalliance.org. And be sure to join us next week. I can't wait. Until then, I'm Paul Brandes Rauschenbusch on The State of Belief, where religion and democracy meet.